Okay. Well, let's get started, if that's okay with you, Dan.
It's kind of fun to meet you
All
because
right.
I'm also a fan of painting, even though I collect painting because it's another thing that goes on my wall. And Joe Bear actually gave me two paintings, and Mangold gave me work with also for free. In the case of both of these artists, um, Joe Bear had hoped to be with Green Gallery. When it went out of business, um, um, she had no money, and I found Herb Vogel's wife. His cousin was a psychiatrist in Los Angeles. He wanted to buy art, so I recommended Robert Mangold and Joe Bear. Um, um, uh, he um, he said his wife didn't like the work, so he put it in his office. And with Joe, she got the money and bought a castle in Ireland. Um, Being kind of Leo, and I think we both realized there was a period when painters um, were, were were not taken very seriously by the minimal artist crowd, right? But yet Bob Mangold and Solo were actually best friends, and they
Right.
shared a lot of ideas.
Let's jump into that in just a second. If you don't mind, let me just do a quick introduction for the folks that are tuning in. My name is Matt Levy, and I'm here with Dan Graham on the occasion of Robert Mangold's exhibition at Pace Gallery, which is currently on view at Pace by appointment through their website through October 24th. And like I said, my name is Matt Levy. I'm an associate professor of art history at Penn State Behrend here in Erie, Pennsylvania, where I'm broadcasting from, in my kitchen in these pandemic times. And the gentleman sharing the screen with me likely needs no introduction, but this is Dan Graham, a distinguished artist who lives and works in New York City. He is a friend of Robert Mangold, as well as a collector of his works. Dan is known for his early conceptual works of art, as well as his groundbreaking work in video and his site-specific architectural pavilions, which can be found in art institutions and public spaces around the world. In addition to his artistic practice, Dan is also an accomplished writer and art critic. So Dan, thanks again for doing this conversation with me. I thought maybe I'd love to talk about what you were just leaving off on, this relationship between painters and sculptors, but I thought maybe an interesting place to start would be, I was reading about, your work and your career recently, and I was looking at an article about your 2009 retrospective at the Whitney Museum, and you had this wall text that I gather that you wrote, where you mentioned artists that had been important to you throughout your career, and Robert Mangold was one of them.
Well, artists often don't talk about their influences, so I had a section called influences, and I mentioned not just friends, but many of the artists were actually LA artists. I think I learned more from LA artists even than New York artists. In fact, I conceived the show and organized it myself originally for MoCA in LA as a homage to LA artists. Also included architects who were quite important to me. Venturi, Izuku Asagawa, and these are the things that artists are taught not to give away.
Right. The magician giving away his secrets.
I remember Flavin, who was not a particularly nice guy. A lot of his work was homages to other artists like Tapper. And Flavin had a big influence on me that way. So I think this is quite important. These kind of inspiration situations, plus just informal conversations you have with artists. I didn't go to art school. I knew nothing about art, so I learned about art. My gallery failed by just meeting artists occasionally. One thing I learned was that Solowit and even Mangold work had a lot to do with humor. And the important thing was a kind of deadpan humor that we liked. I think Liechtenstein uh, had that idea, was involved with that, and you kind of in text I read, you actually saw that Mangold's work was very playful and there's some humor in it.
Yeah, and I think that sometimes people don't pick up on that humor, or perhaps it gets lost in some of the commentary about Bob's work. And I wonder if you have any thoughts as to why that is. Is it just because art critics aren't maybe known for their senses of humor, or why do you think that people are perhaps not so quick to grasp that quality of the work?
Very blunt. To succeed, artists have to have a trademark. My work is hybrid, and at the moment, I'm experiencing no success because I go between different things. When I first got into art, Solowit and Flavin were guards at the Russian Constructivist show. And what I picked up from Russian Constructivism is the work was somewhere between between design, art, and architecture, and also photography. And I would add, in my case, literature was equally important. So this kind of hybridness of art, I think both galleries and critics try to categorize everything in terms of a fixed identity. And Bob is always kind of defeating that. In other words, you see square paintings he does, but then he combines that with trapezoid paintings.
Right. So that difficulty to kind of pin things down and to pigeonhole things. That makes a lot of sense. Before I move, I need to address one other logistical thing for our conversation before I move on to another topic. For the folks that are viewing, this is conducted through a Zoom webinar, and we have a Q&A feature. And we'll be saving the last 15 minutes of our discussion for questions and answers for a Q&A. So at any point during this conversation, you're welcome to submit a question, and I'll be seeing them and can bring them up towards the end. And you also have the ability to upvote questions that you think are particularly good, so we can I can see that kind of factored into the listing of questions as well. Okay, so getting back to the sense of humor that you see in Bob's work. I mean, it's a kind of deadpan humor, right? Which is kind of.
I know the same thing. Yeah, it's deadpan, and somehow I think it also has very common references. Bob was using Masonite, which is usually used for kind of do-it-yourself projects by suburban husbands in their garage, or maybe to make modifications of the house. And of course, I wrote this article, Homes for America, which is really listed all the different colors that women like and men like in terms of selecting a color for their house. I think I also that time period, I remember rock music, that there were songs like Mr. Pleasant by the Kings, Nowhere Man. So it was a cliche of suburbia. And I think
the classic one is Little Boxes by is it Malvina Reynolds? Right? Yeah. We're talking about some of this early work. I brought in some images in. Let me share my screen here so folks can see some of these early paintings that we're talking about that might have these references to the suburbs that Bob is that Dan rather is referencing.
The colors are used in houses. You had a limited amount of different color possibilities, but I think Bob also modulates between different colors.
And
so it's not a color or another.
Like this one here that kind of shades to gray towards the bottom.
But you mentioned to me before, this could be the sky.
Yeah, well, and with a work like this one, these area paintings, he said he got these shapes by looking out at the skyline from the top of his loft building, and these are like the negative spaces that he observed between buildings. I want to pick up on your observation about how this work relates to the suburbs, and that was actually something that came up a lot in critics' reviews of these early shows of Bob's. They liken the works to segments of prefabricated architecture, and of course this is kind of the heyday of these planned communities like Levittown and things of that nature. And of course that's what your Homes of America piece was picking up on too. Do you see these colors as like common like living room colors, or because in
I was,
Bob's also talked about these paintings as having a kind of almost like a ready-made type of color, where he was drawing color from just things that were around him, like a manila folder in the case of this one, or like he said he got a green from like a stapler that he had. So it's almost a kind of like Duchampian use of color too. Is that something that you have picked up on in his work?
maybe that's how actually artists produce work. But to me, the content really is cliches. I
Mm-hmm.
think I think Lichtenstein was more important than people thought he was. He often did sunsets, right? Mhm. Um, um, and some of the paintings of Mangolds that I have are they're curved at the bottom, and it's kind of the color is kind of modulates between um, um, mm, um, red and brown, which is like a sunset in a certain way.
Mm-hmm.
Um, mm, um, so, but at the same time, at the same time, he's alluding to materials that are used maybe to modify houses when you make you make changes
Yeah.
to the structure.
Yeah, there's certainly a hardware store aesthetic to these things, especially like in a work like this, or like this is a work that's now destroyed. But
It's almost not a painting.
yeah, and so I the connection to the suburbs is something that people certainly picked up on when these works were first shown. I wonder though, do you think that they also relate just to the nature of loft living? And Bob was living in a loft at the time, and when you're living in these, big open spaces, I'd imagine that building walls, building partitions is sort of part of a kind of common, household renovation in those types of spaces too. Do you think that's going on here too?
Um, I think all those things generate doing things in a very unorthodox way. Mainly, he was not using a canvas.
Right. Yes. And certainly reacting against like
And secondly,
fine art materials.
I remember going to galleries
Mhm.
when he was not very well known, and I was not known at all. The main thing there was the shaped canvas. So the artists were trying to use very flamboyant colors and very zany shapes. I remember Chuck Hinman, who used to be a baseball player, um, also did the shaped canvases. So he was going against that with a kind of in-your-face blandness. Um, um, on the other hand, he studied color theory. His teacher was Albers, and I kind of disregard the Bauhaus aspect of his teaching, Albers' teaching. Now when I look at Albers' paintings, they use color in such an incredible, subtle way.
Mhm.
And in a way, Mangold is a colorist.
Yeah, certainly. And I think that Albers is often thought of as being this very having this very theoretical approach to color, but the approach to color really was based on observation, right? And really kind of empowering the artist's observational faculties. And I think that Bob's color draws on that too, right? In these paintings, these early paintings, especially that we're seeing, where he's drawing on these often overlooked colors that are around us all the time.
Well, um, also he would undermine the last kind of series he did with these kind of arabesque kind of lines, and the idea of painting.
Mm-hmm.
Actually, using pen. I think is a pencil or
For his drawn lines, yeah, graphite, yeah.
because that seems almost to be drawings. And also, some of the paintings I have, he actually makes different sections. There's a gap between one section and another section.
Mm-hmm.
And what he's also doing, particularly in some of the last work, the last show I saw actually at Pace Gallery, the wall itself is in the center. And, I think I think it might be he's making fun of Robert Ryman, who I know Solowitz didn't like very much.
Hmm.
In other words, um, um, remember Ryman said something. He's a hillbilly guy from Tennessee. He said I want my painting to be nothing but my way. And other people see
And
it.
so you see that, you see the white of the wall and in some Mangold paintings as maybe touching on Ryman.
I think there may be. That's because I know Saul's nasty humor, which maybe I shouldn't. I actually going to repeat it right now. Saul Ryman had a barber chair in the studio.
Mm-hmm.
And Saul said he would masturbate in front of the canvas. Let's just say, maybe, um, maybe Ryman had a simplistic formula that was working. Remember, artists secretly were competing with each other. Sometimes they do it with humor. Um, but on the other hand, I just think it's a brilliant idea to have that center of a series of paintings, to have the wall in the center,
Yeah.
rather than on the sides. In other
Sure.
words,
Yeah, and these things like this and these works certainly, you know, bring in a lot of negative space and kind of create an awareness of the architecture in a way that perhaps more kind of classically modernist paintings, which didn't intend to do. Um,
you brought in this early work of Solowit.
yeah, I wanted to come back to that. So you mentioned Saul, and maybe this would be a good opportunity to talk about the relationship between Saul and Bob, who were you know, lifelong friends since they met in New York in the 60s. And this, I'm showing here this installation view of an exhibition at the John Daniels Gallery, which you directed at the time. You showed this work. And these sculptures, these early sculptures of Saul's, which are very different from the work that he would later become better known for. But Saul was showing these kinds of things that around the same time that Bob was showing work like this. And to my view, these things really kind of are speaking to one another, and the artists were very close at this time and were certainly aware of what the other was making. What do you make of the kinds of exchanges that were happening?
Art that's between things is not one thing or the other. Um, um, I know Saul originally was very interested in happenings. His best friend was Michael Kirby, who wrote about happenings. I see that very early work in a way it's almost like stage sets.
It's what now?
Something like a stage set.
Yeah.
He also used a very strange material, a kind of shellac lacquer. That wasn't really, you couldn't relate that to art in any way.
Yeah, and Bob also was not really working with artist paints. I think they both kind of were avoiding those fine art materials. And they're both making these things that kind of you could say kind of blur the line between painting and sculpture, right? I mean, there's with these large, you know, two-dimensional planes in a work like this, these kind of projecting planes. I mean, there is a kind of relationship to painting here, even though these things are ostensibly sculptures. So yeah, I think they're both interested in kind of blurring the lines between mediums. And I also, you know, even I want to come back to, like, you know, this work here, which you said is similar to something that you own, correct?
Yes.
Yeah. You know, this came. It was shown in Bob's next exhibition at the Fishbach Gallery, where these were all works that were portions of a circle, right? Various kind of subdivisions of a circle, and so there was a kind of overarching conceptual schema to the show.
Well,
And this show actually came before, you know, Saul's, you know, first, you know, conceptual pieces. Do you see a kind of, I don't know how much stock you put in that term conceptual art. Sometimes artists who get that label stuck to them don't like it very much. But do you see a kind of conceptual side to Bob?
You describe me as a conceptual artist, which I don't think I am.
Mm-hmm.
My best work was about magazine pages, mm-hmm. And influenced by people Kasuth who misunderstood the work and made it into something that was called conceptual art. Now, I want to bring in one thing about these shapes. I know that Saul Witt and Bob Ryman in summer used to wear a baseball cap, and they love baseball. I often think when I'm in plane coming into JFK, looking down Long Island, I see the baseball diamond. Sometimes I see that in Mangold's paintings as well.
Yeah. I mean, hard not to see this one right now.
In some ways, these are the kind of things that sometimes unconsciously actually happen when you're making artwork. They both had a great love for baseball. Saul said baseball's a game of inches. He's a Virgo, so he meant numbers, but he also meant penis size. Because also Saul's humor was sexual, in other words, I think both Saul and Bob Mangold were interested in logic and unlogic at the same time.
Yeah.
And I think with Mangold, the work is balanced and then also unbalanced. It's a play between. Also, there's a logic to the painting, and then it makes it illogical at the same time.
Yeah, no, I absolutely. I mean, I think you can see that, even in these early works here, like something like this, where you have this symmetrical sectioning of the work with that middle seam, but then various elements that kind of disrupt that symmetry. Or you see something like that here, and then once he starts to introduce the drawing into the painting, there's often that kind, and I wish I had more images to share, but there's often that kind of off things that are kind of off kilter or off balance, and that are a result of the tensions between the shape of the canvas and the drawing, right? I want to ask you something about something else that you'd mentioned. You touched on it a little bit today, and you mentioned it also in our last chat before this event. This idea of blandness. You see that as being a kind of an important concept.
Well, I think.
Could you elaborate on that for us?
Yes. I know the idea of nothing was very important. Emptiness and nothing. I mean, you have existentialism, but in fact, blandness is something different. It's about the something that's very ordinary. I remember there was an article by Roland Barthes, which is published in a magazine that Theobald Nage did. The article is called "The World as Object," and it was about the Dutch painter Sonderdam, who painted empty church interiors, and they're in kind of bland pastels. Also, an artist who we've kind of forgotten about, Walter Darby Banneret. He also uses kind of pastels.
Well, so what's the appeal of, or could you, maybe for those of us who haven't read the essay, the Barthes essay that you're talking about, bland. We often look to art to like escape blandness, right? It's not often that it's something that we find or we're looking for in art. So what do you think is the power of art that embraces blandness as a characteristic?
We try to reject what's there anyway.
What's that?
I think it's also people say my Homosemeric article was a sociological critique of suburbia. What I was doing was actually making fun of typical Esquire magazine feature, where there would be people like Sigmund Schur photographing the banality of suburbs, and sociologists critiquing it. In fact, it was just there. So I think the idea of what is just there in front of you which could be very bland, maybe was very, very important at that moment. When I think about Lichtenstein paintings, I think he had, I think of the Ramones in a way.
Oh yeah, how so?
Um, um, kind of very simple stereotypes that people accept.
Hmm. Hmm.
Uh, so maybe the stereotype that I was interested in was actually the kind of painting, the kind of colors that people selected um, for their house. And
Yeah.
I made a chart, which I made it myself. Likes by women and likes by men, which of course are not exactly the same.
Right. Right. Yeah. Yeah. Oh, and there were, speaking of the suburbs, there were all these, periodicals that kind of catered to, especially women's taste in colors as like home interior decorating became
Oh, yes. Mhm.
a major preoccupation for.
Well, I think Robert Mangold is not unaware of that.
Yeah.
In other words, that's of equal importance as Albers.
Yeah. Well, and it's interesting that you mentioned Walter Darby Bannard, because he wrote an article in Art Forum around the time we're talking about, and I'm blanking on the name of the article, but it was all about this idea of ready-made color. How when he went to the hardware store, there was this this world of color available to him, that in comparison, the kind of colors that he found in a fine art shop seemed pretty restricted. Um, and so this idea of found color, yeah, is again kind of in the air, right, at this time.
Well, it's also the idea of the ordinary rather than the sublime. Wasn't abstract expressionist trying to go supposedly to some kind of sublime?
Mm-hmm.
This is the opposite of that. Remember, every movement tries to undermine the last one.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And that reminds me of something I read. You said this in an interview. You're talking about the almost kind of quasi-functional nature of some of the art of this generation, right? Like you mentioned that Lewitt with those wooden sculptures that I was showing earlier. He felt like, okay, well, they're made of wood. After the show's over, these things can be used for firewood, or a Dan Flavin sculpture can go back to the hardware store. And
But also, it solves kind of humor, right?
yeah, but I think it might be Bob's kind of sense of humor too, because there was a kind of quasi-functional quality to some of these early works, or at least to the ones that weren't successful. I remember where he commented that.
But I also think that comes.
Wall paintings. I'm sorry.
I think that comes from Russian constructivism, in a way. Which is a huge influence on all that show. The Great Russian Experiment at MoMA. As I said, Solowit and Danstein were guards there.
Right.
And
Bob was.
When I look at Stella's painting, strike paintings, it's identical to Boshenko. I like the work he's doing now better, because it has more humor. But you have to realize how important Russian constructivism was for a generation of artists living in Europe.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, and it reminds me of so some of these early wall paintings that Bob considered not successful actually ended up just being used around the house. Like there was one that ended up as a partition in his loft, and he was experimenting with one with pegboard actually in one of these works, and he ended up not liking that. I think he gave that one to Eva Hesse, and that became a kind of like divider in her kitchen. So there's this. This kind of quasi-functional aspect to some of these works, and then also a lot of artistic exchange, right? A lot of like artists giving artists different things, like Ava and Saul Lewitt exchanged coffee tables. Did you observe that kind of almost like barter economy going on and when you were coming up?
Well, I didn't have a loft, but I'll give you an example of Saul's humor. He said his first open frameworks, he said that there were jungle gyms for his cat.
They were for his cat.
His cat.
Yeah, yeah.
Um, um, of course, the work was always for Saul. Everything. The idea was to be against humanism. That's what I mean. It's liberal humanism. Jewish people like Saul and I, we were taught that the important thing is liberal humanism. But I think underneath liberal humanism, in the 50s, there was also hidden fascism and fear. I see that in most of Maria's work, actually Jack Goldstein. But I guess Saul always tried to undermine the way work would be interpreted. Another very big influence on Saul, because we changed the subject, is after he had some success, because I got him into the drawing gallery, he went to Istanbul. He said that changed his life.
You went to where?
Istanbul. He says that changed his life.
Oh, is that right?
I think that's where a lot of the wall drawing came from.
Okay, interesting. Yeah. To change gears and to bring it back to Bob a little bit more, you told me earlier that you were perhaps most familiar with Bob's works from the 60s, some of the works that I was showing. What did you make of the transition when he started introducing drawing to the work? I mean, did you see that as a significant departure from the stuff that you'd been familiar with to that point, or did you see it as an extension of it?
Well, first of all, I knew a lot about his work because he had base galleries send me catalogs.
Okay.
And I will have to admit, I took a lot of ideas for my doing mirror glass structures from his drawings. And I really liked the fact that he was totally undermining assumptions about the first work, the earlier work that he did. The arabesques with a line, and I think his mind conceptually was trying out a lot of new ideas, but he did that actually with drawings on paintings.
Yeah, right. Yeah, and that really there's just the facility with his drawing, right, and the way that he can create those kind of beautiful arabesques, or these circles that, when you first see them as circles and then you sort of realize that they're sort of off kilter. It's kind of startling about when you compare it to some of those like kind of deliberately clunky shaped canvases, right? I mean, it must have caught some by surprise.
But I think that well, I also I saw some you mentioned you're from the Boston area. In the Museum of Fine Arts, he was able to do very large pieces that worked in the museum, huge museum walls. Mm-hmm. So he was able to work in small sizes and very large sizes. And for most painters, did the same thing over and over again. Even if they were geniuses like Pollock, he was like very similar. So I think he was always thinking about where the piece would be possibly hung.
You see Bob doing that?
Well, I like the way he was able to do very large pieces that would work in a museum context.
Yeah, yeah. Well, and there's often a kind of like two-step process to the work, right? He'll usually make kind of smaller studies and then make a larger version, right? That often seems to be how he sort of works through his ideas. I'd love to ask your thoughts about what did you make of the current exhibition? I gather you got to see it today.
No, I got to see it last week.
Oh, okay, last week. Sorry.
We made it a sneak visit. Mm-hmm. Also to go to other galleries because they're reopening. I haven't been to Chelsea in a long time. I think they were made for maybe corporate lobbies in a way. Maybe because the building the cake bases in is a very corporate building. So it fit that situation, but also they're very logical. He's not been making new work. he put together work that functioned together um, um, uh, to make almost a system. But then I realized everything wasn't square. He had some trapezoids as part of the square, um, and I love the way his color has evolved. Um, I, I told people I was with that I preferred this color to that color.
Uh-huh.
Like I love the green.
Uh-huh.
This is almost like khaki.
Yeah.
Or the people wearing camouflage things.
Yeah.
And also I've noticed, because I've never seen this before, the kind of modulation of color, um, um, which I hadn't seen before in his work before. So he, um, I think there's always at least some, even though the work is structurally similar, there's always something slightly new in every show he does.
Yeah. Well, and this body of work really caught me by surprise in a couple of ways. In that it's the first work that he's made really since the '60s, since the '60s that didn't have drawing. Right. Most of the paintings in this show do contain drawing. Some version of these drawn squares or double squares, but there are three paintings in the show that have no drawing, and in that way, I mean, it's an extension of the work that's elsewhere in the exhibition. It kind of continues that kind of theme of various configurations of squares, but to abandon the drawing, which really had become something that he was so well known for over the years. What did you make of that move?
Well, I don't see things as exactly moves. I know that when I make a gallery show, I think very much of the gallery space. And also, I also know the way art is going now. A lot of work is now bought for corporate lobbies. And at first I thought the work was a little bit too aimed at corporate lobby. Then I realized there were aspects that are unexpectedly asymmetrical. I know one artist's work I like enormously for corporate lobbies, Frank Stella, because he's trying to combine graffiti and Baroque at the same time. First I was a little put off by the show because it just seemed to be too regular, like this architecture of this gallery. But then I realized it wasn't exactly what I thought at first. Because, in other words, I think his work first is symmetrical and then it's not symmetrical.
Yeah, every work I think has something that's like a little askew about it, right? There's
I also think it's about balance. I keep thinking that he's a Libra. Libra is about balance, but he also does unbalance at the same time.
That's interesting. I know nothing about astrology, but I know that it's come up a couple times already, and in this case, it certainly is an interesting thing to think about.
Well, there is always
that tension between balance and imbalance, and that's certainly true with
symmetry, which is the same thing, right?
What's that?
You could also call it symmetry and asymmetry.
Mm-hmm.
And he's using some of the same elements that Saul used. In other words, common, simple geometrical forms.
Mm-hmm.
But then sometimes the color offsets that first impression.
Right, and the drawing complicates it too, right? Where you'll the shape of a canvas will sort of your perception of it is altered by the drawing. So like, for example, there's one work where there might be a kind of rectangular kind of extension of the canvas, but then that extension has drawing in it that kind of extends it into a square. So your mind knows that what you're looking at is a kind of rectangular extension, but it's impossible not to see it as a square, right? So the shape of the canvas and the drawing kind of rub against one another and kind of mess with your perception of the thing.
Well, how I would rate the show, to me, it's only a 3. Whereas the last space show was very unexpected, because that was where I first saw I saw the center. We showed the wall itself.
Mhm.
In other words,
Oh, and this work does that, but it's different too from the last body of work, right? Where the last body of work at Pace had a lot of these square apertures cut into the painting, but then there were these kind of arabesques that kind of brought them together and kind of enlivened them. Um, Here, there's almost a more kind of conceptual use of the square, right? Where you have kind of three different iterations of the square. You have this square shaped canvas, you have these square apertures, and then you have the square drawing, right? So it's almost like three different representations of the idea of a square. Kind of come back perhaps to that conceptual side in Bob's work.
maybe I don't like the idea of conceptual things. And of course, I like when he got into the arabesque, which was very unexpected. But I think, given this particular space here, it made a lot of sense what he did.
Yeah, yeah. And there's one other kind of unexpected element, and there was just one painting where he did this. But there's one work, if you recall, where there's a kind of almost like a relief element to it. There's a square that projects forward. I was curious, what did you make of that painting? Because that's very atypical. He hasn't really done anything that kind of ventured into a relief mode again since a lot of this early work that we started with.
I think it made for a better show than I thought this would be.
Okay, great.
But I think he had one dilemma. He's not really making art in a long time because for health reasons. But he was able, because to put together work that was older, from different periods, and put together a very logical, a beautiful show.
Yeah, I agree.
That's for every artist. Every artist, when they begin, they think they can't do it.
Yeah.
I assume that he has his assistants, and he probably plotted everything out very carefully. So it's a very carefully done show.
It is, and making each of these shaped canvases. I mean, it's a project, right? You kind of have to have a sense that it's going to work, I'd imagine, before you charge ahead. We have about a little less than 15 minutes left, and we have a few questions that have popped up here. Would you like to turn our attention to those? Yeah. Okay. So we have one question saying, can you talk more about material experimentation in Mangold's work? He was using plexiglass within the paintings much before other artists started to think about using materials like that as a component of painting. How uncommon was this? What was the reaction at the time? And I'm not aware of any use of plexiglass in Bob's work, but he was being experimental with his choice of materials for certain, and as we've discussed, not using fine art materials. And could you talk a bit about what was the reaction to those choices of materials at the time?
I think my choice was I loved the fact he was using Masonite.
Okay.
Because I was very familiar with it. It's very banal, but it's the opposite of using canvas, which is high art. And also, I was always thinking of the idea of do-it-yourself. One thing I know one thing about Bob. I think he must have loved cooking because I remember he was always looking. He lived near the Bowery. He kept talking about wanting to find the best butcher block slab he could.
Is that right?
So I think in a way, he maybe had a great interest in a utilitarian use of wood.
Okay, all right.
Remember, the Bowery used to have a lot of butcher block slabs.
Sure. Well, in all those restaurant supply shops, right?
Yeah, exactly. Of course, that was where he was living.
Yep. Right. Right. Yeah. And he also talked about, made a point of mentioning in one interview that he was doing his shopping for materials, perhaps on the Bowery, but also on Canal Street. I mean, what was the kind of cachet of Canal Street at the time in New York?
Everybody loved industrial plastics. First, I know when artists first came to New York, they would buy these different plastics and put them together.
Mm-hmm.
Remember Marika Murray was fascinated because she had a studio on Canal Street. I think I realized Bob and his wife are actually very domestic people. So there's kind of domesticity in the choice of materials.
Yeah, right, absolutely.
He wasn't trying to do epic things in a huge studio. I think where he lived first was a kind of apartment building.
Okay, yeah, that's true. I think he had like a job as a super, I think, in that first building.
Oh yes, really?
Yeah. And again, supers are like, they handle the hardware store is their place, right? So it's interesting, the way these lived experiences kind of inform the work. Here's another question that perhaps draws on some of the things we were just discussing. This writer says, I see deadpan humor in Sylvia Mangold's paintings as well. The piles of clothes and trompe-l'oeil paintings. Could you talk about their influence on one another's work? Does the humor come from a response or observation of the quotidian or mundanity of life in the country of upstate New York? So, but maybe there are two parts to the question there. Maybe if you talk a bit about your sense of the relationship between Bob and Sylvia and how what kinds of artistic exchanges happen there, and then maybe we could talk about their move to upstate New York, where they've lived for some time now.
Well, when I saw Sylvia's work first, I thought it was about being very literal. In other words, things looked, everything looked as if it was over literal. Which is slightly different from Bob being interested in banality. But I also think they're a very close couple. I know they cooked and had small dinner parties. And this is not what artists in the past used to do, right? In other words, they were very subtle couple. The reason Bob told me he moved was after Eva Hassel died. It was just too tragic for him. He wanted to move away from the city. Actually, I never saw him after that. He said they only come into New York now to see doctors for their health conditions. Although, of course, there's a tradition of artists buying barns, like Elspeth Kelly bought a barn, and then selling in upstate New York. Whether being in the midst surrounded by nature had anything to do with his work changing, I think it did.
Yeah. And that curved section of a circle that we talked about that you likened to a baseball diamond, and I'll never unsee that now. But he started making those sections of a circle after spending a summer again up in upstate New York at the summer house of Al Held. Like I said, I had a farm up there, and he was observing, rather than observing, those negative spaces between buildings in the skyline, he was seeing these kind of, really kind of swooping curves on the horizon line in the valley. So that's where he's attributed those shapes to. And so, you can see the way that the change of environment.
I'd also think that Bob still looks at baseball games on TV.
Oh yeah, so baseball is still a force in his life. It's still a factor.
But I also think people have recreational things that sustain them, and also they get strange enough to get ideas from. Mm-hmm. I know that Edward Shade's very small books, with friends, and there's always a kind of humor there. Like the royal road test. Mm-hmm. I think Edward Shade came from Oklahoma, and the road was very important. Mm-hmm. And also, the artists are always destroying things, right, to make art.
Another way of life informing art, perhaps. Maybe one last question from our list here, and then a nice comment that I want to close with. Another question about influences. You know, we've talked a lot about Bob and Saul, and Bob and Joseph Albers. Any other artists from you know the circle that you all were in that you think are worth mentioning here in this context?
Well, first of all, I was not in circle.
Okay.
It's just that I saw Saul often because I lived next door, and I'd come by. I never saw Bob, but over the years I realized Bob was a great artist. And for some reason, I think he was the first person actually to understand the very early magazine page pieces. And out of that appreciation, he would just give me paintings. I can't guess who influenced him, but of course, they had Sylvia and he had a very successful son.
Sure. Yeah, the film director.
Yeah. The first film was that Mangold made, James Mangold, was heavy. He was a man who was overweight. Probably an ordinary person from the neighborhood where he grew up, in so-called upstate New York. Then Copland, I found very interesting because I thought it was a little like Catherine Bigelow's film Blue Steel. It was about cops, policemen who lived in New Jersey, then commuted to New York City. So I think maybe Bob liked the ordinary. It's sort of like Van Gogh also. He liked the fact that there were ordinary people where he was living, not just art world types. I think people flee the city from that artists for that reason. I know Sylvia is when I talk to her, she's just so happy that her son became a great painter. A great filmmaker. I know that Saul put up a lot of money for that.
Is that right? Wow. Well, that's very sweet. Let me actually bring in one more question before we close. This person writes, Mangold talks a lot about fragments, quote, being very much a part of the content of the work, something that extended to different series in different ways, the sense of completeness or incompleteness, or perhaps the impossibility of completeness. Yeah, and that's, what do you make of that, Dan, of the role of the fragment in Bob's work? And we saw that like even in that circle painting, especially the segments of a circle.
I
He said that when you see the fragment of a circle,
I think that applies.
The form it comes from.
I think that applies more to the earlier work.
Yeah.
But in the end, he's not like Apertures at all. He's not systematic. And also, the color sometimes is very surprising. In other words, there's surprises that are kind of deliberate in the work he's doing.
Yeah, you mentioned that he's not a systematic artist, but there was a period of time where he was, right. Those WVX paintings, if you recall those, there was a moment there where he was kind of creating every possible iteration of a certain kind of system, but then he moved away from that, right? And I think it's because he found it kind of perhaps too restrictive. But I think he kind of retained some of that as in the exhibitions that he has made over the years, where when you go to one of Bob's gallery shows, you see certain kinds of parameters present, right? And then he's working through the various possibilities of those parameters, not in a kind of exhaustive way, but they still set certain conditions in place that he's working through. Do you agree with that?
I think we have to put this out. Saul's work seems to be logical, but it's not logical. And I think Robert Mangold had a logical mind, but the work is not exactly logical.
Yeah, yeah. Well, you can. There's a difference between being between work coming from a system and being logical, right? I mean, he often talked about how his work was sort of had sort of a certain kind of premise to it that was launching off point into the illogical, you know? But that's just a possibility. And actually, perhaps this is a nice way to close, because we have actually a comment from Carol LeWitt, who thanks us both for this discussion and says, please tell Dan how much I enjoyed his remembrances and remind him how much we respect his wisdom and how much we treasure our long friendship. So I think that's a very sweet note to perhaps close on, if that sounds okay.
What's interesting is Saul chose to live in very suburban Connecticut, where he came from. Mm-hmm. And I'm inspired when I go back to New Jersey. In other words, I guess traditionally artists often, like Courbet, very inspired by going back to his farm-like area.
Yeah. No, we always kind of take that with us, don't we?
I think it's a miracle that Mangold's still making art.
Yeah.
He has very big health problems, as I do.
What's that?
He has extremely big, he says he has big health problems. But I always invite him to come to New York to see some of my shows. Mm-hmm. He says it's not possible.
Well, then I think we should really appreciate this current show all the more then.
Well, I think he's one of the great artists. And he's also very unexpected, because he's not heroic. I mean, in terms of the work being so busy.
Yeah. No, I totally agree. Well, listen, Dan, thank you so much for this conversation. I thoroughly enjoyed it, and I hope others do as well, or did as well. And this work will be archived with Paste and will be available online for later viewing. So please look for it there. But thanks again to Dan and to the folks at Paste for hosting this. And just as a reminder, Robert Mangold's exhibition Paintings 2017 to 2019 is currently on view at Paste and will be through October 24th by appointment only. So please make those appointments on the Paste website. So thanks again, Dan.
And also, I hope you're not too jealous that I have some early Mangolds.
Are you kidding? I'm very jealous.
Yeah. In other words, there's a collector in everybody, including artists. Of course, I trade, so I don't have to buy any of the paintings of the art. But you know why we trade? We artists. It's actually a token of our love for each other. Mm-hmm. But I don't really have much space because I have very small space.
Yeah. Well, you got to look for those small works then.
I think you owed something.
What's that?
Maybe you owed a drawing.
All right. Well, listen. I think we have to wrap this up.
I love his work.
Yeah, I'm glad. I think we certainly share that. Well, but thank you again, Dan. This has been a real pleasure.